Hi, I'm Shark Whitebeard, here at Shark's Tavern making a video. And the name of this video is, it's the story of Agincourt, which is a story I tell at the Ren fairs and pirate festivals. People come up and I'll go ahead and tell the story. And what it is, it was during the 100 Years' War between England and France, 1415. Henry V, King Henry V of England, was a young man, and he had landed in England, or he crossed over from England across English Channel into France with 8,000 soldiers and marched into France, and then he had some problems, some sickness and stuff like that. So he was down to 6,000 men. He lost about 2,000, and then he decided that he'd done enough, and he was going to turn around and come back and march back to the coast, to a port, and get ships and sail back into England to safety. So he's on his march back to the coast, and there's a place called Agincourt, and the French block him off. They block his path. And there's a lot of historians that kind of have their own version of what happened and how many soldiers actually took place, were there, and everything like that. But I'll just tell you the story that I heard. So he's 6,000 men marching to the coast, and he's confronted by 30,000 French knights, men-at-arms, mounted men-at-arms, and some crossbow archers. And so King Henry, they block his path, and it's a grassy meadow, both sides. They have trees on both sides. So he tells his men, he dismounts his knights and his men-at-arms, he dismounts them and puts them in the center. He puts his archers, half his army are longbow archers, who are taken from the peasant class, yeomen, farmers, freemen. And he puts them on the flank, and they sharpen wooden sticks and stick them out in front to make like a barrier to block the stop from the cavalry charge from the knights. So he does that, and it rained the night before, so it's pretty muddy. The grassy meadow that they're going to charge across is pretty muddy. So he builds a barrier, sticks his men in the center, his archers on the side. They said back then that a longbow archer, that he could pin a knight to his saddle at 200 yards, and they could put 3 arrows in the air at any one time. So basically, the French send the crossbow guys. They send them forward, and the longbow guys are able to outdistance them and rain arrows down on them before they could even get close enough to fire back. So they break and run. They break and they run. So then the knights, the French knights, this is the French nobility, the armored, well-mounted on horses, they charge in. And the archers, the English archers, just start putting arrows into the air and start just raining arrows down on them. And across this grassy meadow in this muddy area, it turns all to mud with all these horses charging against it. And the whole line goes down. And then the second line of French knights and mounted men-at-arms, they just plow into them and they pile up on top of them. And the archers just keep pouring arrows into them, and the next line piles up and piles up on top of them. The way the story goes is the knights did make it as far as the center of the men-at-arms, and the dismounted knights are fighting in the center of King Henry's defense, and they're trying to push their way through. It said the situation got so desperate in the defense that King Henry himself had to run in and try to prop up the defense. At that point, the archers dropped their bows and charged in with axes and swords and finished off the knights who had been piled up there. And this is one of the greatest battles, victories that the English had over the French. And some people say it was the end of chivalry, the end of knights, that they were no longer could dominate the battlefield because these peasant farmers armed with longbows could take them out and could defeat them in a major battle. So, and it was a class thing. It's where you had the nobles, well-armed, mounted, and everything, and trained against the farmers, the peasants who could defeat them nowadays. But the story that I heard, and the story I like, the rest of the story that I heard, is that 500 years later, that the English had landed a small expeditionary force of soldiers to aid the French against the Germans in World War I against Kaiser Wilhelm. So the English army had marched in to France, and then they were confronted by a superior German army, and they realized that if they tried to engage the German army, they would be defeated and wiped out. So they got the orders to retreat and then make a run for the coast and get some ships to get back into England to safety. And the way the story goes is that at some point, just by chance, by accident, they crossed through Agincourt on their way back to the coast, just like King Henry had done 500 years earlier. And so when they got back to England, the soldiers there that had made it to safety, there was a journalist who wrote for an English newspaper. And he was there interviewing soldiers, and he printed a story in the English newspaper that he had interviewed numerous different English soldiers. And they had told him that they would have been caught and wiped out and defeated by the Germans at Agincourt. Except, out of the fog and mist, appeared longbow archers dressed in medieval garb and costumes, and that they fired their arrows and held back the Germans long enough for the English armor to make it to safety. And he printed that story in the newspaper. What some people think is that the journalist, trying to spin the story, make give people hope that he made up the story himself and printed it in the newspaper to give the English people hope that, that it wasn't a total defeat. Some people think that he did interview English soldiers, and that these soldiers that he interviewed were so desperate in need of something to pray for, something to come and save them, that they hallucinated and imagined that these medieval archers had come to the rescue and saved them. But I'm not saying I believe this, but the version I'd like to believe is what some people say, is that in the desperate need of the English army 500 years later, that the souls and spirits of the longbow archers who fought at Agincourt came to their safety, came to their rescue and saved them from being annihilated by the Germans, came back from the grave. And that's the story I like to hear, and that's the story I'd like to believe. I don't know if I believe it or not. But, and that's the story of Agincourt. Please subscribe, share, like, give me a thumbs up, and post a comment if you like stories like this. Thank you very much.